everyone and welcome to Sinful Gaming. I hope you're all doing well, I hope you're all staying safe, and most of all, I hope you're all fighting that war against Grey. Today's video, we're going to talk about taking your army from Warhammer Fantasy times to bring it up to a Warhammer Age of Sigmar army. What we're going to aim to do in this video is we're going to aim to show you where your army's moved over to into Warhammer Age of Sigmar if you're coming from a Warhammer Fantasy background. The reason for this is lately I've been getting a lot of new players in my local community that are all coming over from Warhammer Fantasy or haven't played since Warhammer Fantasy times, and they've missed a few of the years, or they're coming from Warhammer Total War, which is another way I guess you've experienced fantasy, and to sort of show you where those armies are now lying in the world of Warhammer Age of Sigmar. I think for me, I played Warhammer Fantasy for a ton of years. It was my very first wargame that I ever played properly, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I've now moved over to Warhammer Age of Sigmar, and I'm enjoying the game immensely. I think they both offer great and varied different things. So I'm going to talk about where your army was in Warhammer Fantasy or Warhammer Total War, and we're going to show you where those same models, or at least the aesthetic of the models, are now in Warhammer Age of Sigmar. So without further ado, this is taking your army from Warhammer Fantasy to Warhammer Age of Sigmar. So let's start off, I guess, with the poster boys-ish of Warhammer Fantasy. This is the main faction where a lot of the storyline and plot revolves around in Warhammer Fantasy, and that is the Empire. The Empire was this very Germanic-themed nation of men that sat at the heart of the world. Pretty much, they were generic humans who were beset on all sides and within against the monstrosities of the world. And this really is the single aesthetic that they have. They've got generic sort of troops where they've got things like spearmen, archers, cavalry, and even some more monstrous cavalry later on, like the Demigryphonites and all that. But even then, it's not quite the same as a lot of armies around them. They're not monstrous in many ways. The biggest thing they've got is maybe the Griffin, which, you know, is a very minor monster compared to a lot of the stuff around them. Now, this army now has been converted over into something called Cities of Sigmar, which is a bit of an interesting army. Cities of Sigmar is actually a mix of a bunch of old fantasy races pushed together in one army, as the cities are no longer just humans that are the focal point, but instead they're a mixture of elves, dwarves, or dwarden as they're now known, and humans. So, Cities of Sigmar, if you've got an Empire force, you can literally pull that straight into a Cities of Sigmar lift and give you a great place to expand, as you've got access to a ton of all the units you used to love from other Warhammer Fantasy armies like Wood Elves, Dark Elves, and even some High Elf troops in there, and Dwarves as well. So, for me, this is the greatest and the easiest sort of thing. Cities of Sigmar, very much in the lore, is the same sort of thing that Empire is, where it's just generic sort of people. I mean, this one contains elves and dwarves, but in the scope of Warhammer Fantasy, they are very generic in their own right. So it contains all those, you know, normal human and, I guess, almost human races, and they're fighting against the horrors of the mortal realms together, where they are greater than the sum of their parts. This is just the perfect comparison between the two, and if you've got Empire, you would easily have a nice, decent Cities of Sigmar force there waiting for you. Next, we've got the Vampire Counts, who are the, I guess, main death army or death-related army in Warhammer Fantasy. Vampire Counts are pretty much this army that's focused around these vampire lords and ladies who control a horde of undead minions at their will. Now, this pretty much flips straight over, much like how the Empire pretty much goes entirely into Cities of Sigmar. Vampire Counts, for the most part, just goes entirely into Legion of Nagash. There is one thing to mention with this, though, is that with the Legion of Nagash, it is likely that they're currently in the process of getting a rename as the Soulblight Gravelords, so this is maybe something to keep an eye on. Legion of Nagash does take on many aspects that we had with the Vampire Counts. We've got raising dead units, or being able to bring entirely new units to the table. And of course, we've now got the big bad himself, Nagash, back in action in Warhammer Age of Sigmar, so there's that fun you can play around with. A lot of the models in the army remain the same, they do the same sort of thing, and there are, I guess, some sort of parts of this Vampire Counts army where you can go other ways, and we'll talk about that now. One sort of part of the Vampire Counts army is that with the ghouls, the Terrorgeist, and all the weird looking sort of semi-undead cannibalistic creatures that appear in the Vampire Counts, mostly, I guess, related to the Strigoi vampire bloodline. Now, that itself has been brought out in an entirely full faction in Warhammer Age of Sigmar called the Flesh Eater Courts. The ghouls themselves, along with the Terrorgeists and the abhorrent Ghoul Kings and all that sort of stuff, have their own book in Warhammer Age of Sigmar, and they play in their own sort of army besides themselves. So if you've got a lot of ghoul models within your old Vampire Counts armies, maybe you could expand it into a full Flesh Eater Courts army, which is really, really cool. You've got all the pieces there that you need to be able to do this. There is one other part of the Vampire Counts that you can sort of, I guess, take out of there and put into its new faction, and we'll talk about that now. And that last faction is the Nighthaunt. So in the Vampire Counts army, you have things like Spirit Host that came out with a brand new kit late in 8th edition, and you've also got things like the Khaine and Tomb Banshee. All of these have their own army as well. While there's not as many models that are in existence for the Vampire Counts that fit into a Nighthaunt army, you've definitely got the pieces to start off a force there, at least with a couple of these units. So it's always worth considering. If you had a lot of the Spirit stuff there, maybe you could expand it a little and get into Nighthaunt as well. Now, this is one of the most interesting changes from Warhammer Fantasy over to Warhammer Age of Sigmar, and that's how Warriors of Chaos and Daemons of Chaos work in the game. Now, what they've been moved into is, instead of being, I guess, unified Chaos and Chaos Demon faction armies, they're instead split up into God-based armies. So you have all the Warriors of Chaos stuff that was Slaanesh focused is in a book with all the Slaanesh demon stuff called Hedonites of Slaanesh. You have all the Nurgle stuff from both parts of Demons and Warriors taken out and put into Maggotkin of Nurgle, Khorne into Blades of Khorne, and Tzeentch into Disciples of Tzeentch. You also have a generic Warriors of Chaos army that is just mortals with a few of the non-marked demon forces called Slave to Darkness. And lastly, we're also expecting a mixed demon force to be coming out soon, led by Bielakor himself, called the Legion of Chaos Ascendant. All these forces are using a lot of the models, and if you've got especially a Warriors of Chaos force, you can mark that in whichever god you want and either play in Slaves to Darkness or in a particular god-marked army, whether that be Blades of Khorne, Maggotkin of Nurgle, Hedonites of Slaanesh, or the Disciples of Tzeentch. Chaos works slightly different, but you've already got all the pieces and you can easily play all these in a bunch of different. As mentioned, if you've got a Demons of Chaos army, you can play in a army called Legion of Chaos Ascendant, which you can find the rules for currently in the Wrath of the Ever-Chosen supplement book for Warhammer Age of Sigmar, which gives you all the rules for using mixed demon armies. And you've also got access just to a ton of other things you can do, including Grand Alliance Chaos. Chaos really has a ton of things it can do within itself, and if you've got these armies in Warhammer Fantasy, you've got a ton of options for yourself in Warhammer Age of Sigmar. This one's another easy one. Beastmen 2 Beasts of Chaos. It's literally a 1-for-1 swap. Put your army on round bases and you've got a Warhammer Age of Sigmar army ready to go. Beastmen pretty much lost none of their models into Warhammer Age of Sigmar, and they also just pretty much play same sort of thing, and even their lore is very similar. They are the true children of chaos. They see themselves as this primal chaotic nature force thing in the mortal realms, and much they did in Warhammer Fantasy. You've got all the same sort of units. You've got Gors, Ungors, Bestigor, you've got Minotaurs, which have been renamed into Bulgors. What is cool though about Beasts of Chaos is it's very easy to run very specific types of Beastmen in different armies. You can run your Gore heavy army, but you can also have a Minotaur heavy army really easily, or even a whole Dragon Ogre army really easily in Beasts of Chaos, which is really cool and just gives you those more options than probably what you had in Warhammer Fantasy times. Next, we have the Orcs and Goblins army, a popular army in Warhammer Fantasy. And, well, you'll be happy to know that you've actually got a lot of your same options available to you in Warhammer Age of Sigmar. Most of your models haven't disappeared. In fact, we've had a ton of updated kits since the time of Warhammer Fantasy, most notably the Squigs, which is probably the coolest part. There is one part of the Orcs and Goblins army that has disappeared, or rather two, and it is the very generic looking Orcs and Goblins. So the generic Orcs, the Orc Boys, Orc Arab Boys and such have disappeared now. They are no longer part of Warhammer Age of Sigmar, though there are legacy war scrolls you can use to use your models, but maybe you could just use them as some Savage Orcs instead. And the normal goblins, the non-Night Goblin goblins in Warhammer Fantasy have now disappeared as well. But once again, they do have legacy war scrolls you can find to use them in Warhammer Age of Sigmar. It's mostly in events and stuff like that that you won't be able to use them. Now, when you're starting this, you've got actually a lot of options. Now, all your goblin stuff that remains, remember taking away the normal goblins out of this, so your spider goblins, your forest goblins, and your night goblins have been moved into Gloomspite Gitz, along with the Troggoths and the giant that were found in the book. All of them come together and form an army called Gloomspite Gitz, which gives you a ton of different ways to play. In fact, you can also play with your Troggoths, Spider Riders as full armies as well. You've also got access to entire squig armies and entire goblin horde armies with night goblins with a ton of new units, cool characters, and, well, better than ever, new squig models which look absolutely amazing. On the Orc side, we've got them change their name to Orruk Warclans, and you've pretty much got all your Savage Orc stuff there in its own army called Bone Splitters. You've then had the Black Orc range expanded into a full army called the Ironjaws. So now you've got both your old Black Orcs now called Ardboys mixed with a ton of new brutal heavy armoured Orc units, or Orcs as they're known in Warhammer Age of Sigmar. What's cool is with these two different types of Orcs or Orruks, you can combine them into a single force, not just having Ironjaws or Bone Splitters, but also a combined force known as the Big War. This is really cool, and much like Gloomspite Gitz, you've got the ability to play all three types of Orcs. If you've got an old Orcs and Goblins army, you may need a few bits and pieces to make a few of these armies work in Warhammer Age of Sigmar, but you've got the access and just a great base here to expand into a ton of different factions and a ton of different playstyles. Some competitive, some more fun, and just everything in between, which is great. This is really a great army to cross over into Warhammer Age of Sigmar with. Another easy transferal army is the Ogre Kingdoms into Ogor Mawtribes. What's cool about this though is you've got a bunch of easy access to turn this into two unique different forces. You've got your very foot-mounted troop, your Ogre Bulls and Iron Guts and all that sort of stuff in a foot-mounted Ogre army known as the Gutbusters, which is just half the Ogre Mawtribes book, but then your mounted Ogre faction along with the Hunter and the Frost Sabers, or Saber-Tuskers as they were known as Warhammer Fantasy, make their own part of the book called the Beastclaw Raiders. What's cool is you can run both of these as their own armies. You can actually run all monster armies with Beastclaw Raiders as your primary part of the Ogre Mawtribes army, which is awesome. But your army literally just takes all its models and puts them into the other. What's happening in this though is a ton of your character models like Golfag, like Bragg, Gutsman, etc. have become generic man-eater models, and you've also had Scrag the Slaughterer become a Slaughtermaster, a different type of butcher. You've not got any of your named characters anymore in Warhammer Age of Sigmar, as they've all disappeared, and I think one of the only models that disappeared, unfortunately, is Greaser's Goldtooth, but he would make a fantastic looking tyrant model in my eyes. Skaven, much the same. Their army really hasn't changed anything at all, other than obviously squares to round bases. You've got all of your old pieces there, and yes, you've still got some fantastically old models in the Poison Wind Globadiers, now known as Scryer Acolytes. You've got a ton of old models in the range, but they are still all part of that Skaven army. The only single loss that Skaven have suffered so far in Warhammer Age of Sigmar is they lost the Poisoned Wind Mortar, because that kit went out of production when Island of Blood stopped being sold. You've still got all your different pieces, and what's cool, it's really easy as well in Warhammer Age of Sigmar to make clan-specific armies, which makes for a ton of fun, different builds you can play around with your Skaven, whether you want to go Eshin, Scryer, Pestilence, or even, I guess, any of the others as well. You've got a ton of different options you can do. Molder is, of course, the one I forgot there. But you've got also access to a ton of different ways you can play the army, and the army really has some cool little intricacies on how you play around with your battle line for the faction. Lizardmen are another army that hasn't really changed a whole lot. Their biggest change is probably in their name. Lizardmen are now known as Seraphon in Warhammer Age of Sigmar, and pretty much have the same options for all of their troops. They've still got Saurus, they've still got Croxagore, they've still got Stegodons, Bastillodons, Carnosaurs, Cold One Knights, Skinks, and all the stuff you love with your Lizardmen army. Everything's just obviously on round bases now, but you've also got a few different interesting ways to play. Lizardmen went through a massive lore shift, as we knew. They floated off into the void at the end of the Warhammer Fantasy world in Warhammer The End Times, and now they've come back as the Starborn Sailors, some of them even inhabiting the realms and taking on those aspects of, once again, of those Lizardmen sort of traits that they had in Warhammer Fantasy. So you've got options for either the new Age of Sigmar lore or those reverting back to the old lore in Warhammer Fantasy. For me, great army, easy just to literally swap your models over and come play with the same models you used to have. So, Dark Elves are the first of the elf factions we're going to tackle from Warhammer Fantasy, and so they have been split into two major parts. First of all, you have the entire Khainite cult make its own army in Warhammer Age of Sigmar, that's the Witch Elves, and this excludes, however, the Executioners, which were a member of the Khainite cult in Warhammer Fantasy, but are not in Warhammer Age of Sigmar. So you've got all those Witch Elves, the Sisters of Slaughter, and even Morathi herself in a fantastic new God Bestial model, known as the Shadow Queen or Morathi Khaine. Yes, she is now the god of murder herself in an army called Daughters of Khaine. So you've got an entire sort of subsect part of the Dark Elves now. It's fully fledged faction in Warhammer Age of Sigmar. The rest of the Dark Elves, be that the Pirates, the Executioners, Blackguard, or even the basic baseline troops, and things like the Hydra and Cauldron Knights, all are part of Cities of Sigmar, and their own little sub-factions within that force. At this current point, we know absolutely nothing about what Malarian, or previously known as Malekith, is doing in Warhammer Age of Sigmar. He is the greatest unknown in Warhammer Age of Sigmar, and we literally know nothing about him at this time. However, you can use your forces pretty much for everything you've got in Dark Elves can be used in some way, whether in Daughters of Khaine or Cities of Sigmar. There's even a particular way you can play all these Dark Elves together in a Cities of Sigmar faction called Harkuron, which you can get in the Broken Realms Morathi book, which gives you access to a fully focused Dark Elf city. High Elves have been taken a slightly different route than what Dark Elves have been taken in Warhammer Age of Sigmar, and so the Phoenix Guard stuff that was in the old High Elf book is now in Cities of Sigmar. All that stuff focuses around mainly one particular city called the Phoenician, though you can use it in any ones you feel like, but it's just those models. The rest of the High Elf range has actually been retired, everything outside of Shadow Warriors, which also sits in Cities of Sigmar, and it's been replaced with the Lumineth Realmlords range, which is a modernized Age of Sigmar take on High Elves. This really isn't High Elves as you remember them. It is very, very different. It's High Elves with a bit of the Eldar sort of theme and traits taken from Warhammer 40,000 applied to a Warhammer Age of Sigmar universe. It is very different, and it may not be the army for you, and you may find you much rather use your old models to represent the new Lumineth Realmlords. Personally, I love them, but I understand that is not everyone's case. They are quite different, but it is the spiritual successor to your army. If you've got a High Elf army, it's really easy to just convert up and change some base sizes and really use them as Lumineth Realmlords, but you could quite as easily use things like your Swordmasters of Hoeth as great sword stand-ins in a Cities of Sigmar army as well. High Elves do have a ton of options you can move around with, and Lumineth Realmlords are set for another big release soon, so it's a fantastic time to be getting in with some High Elves. Wood Elves, once again, like the other elves, have had a particular part of them taken out and sort of expanded upon, and this was the tree spirit aspect of the Wood Elves taken out and made into a fully fledged army known as Sylvaneth. Sylvaneth have got a ton of new models, but all the old parts there, except for the Treekin, are available to be used in a Sylvaneth army. You could easily use those Treekin models to represent maybe something like Kurnoth Hunters in the combat variations as well, if you so do. Now, what you can also do is a ton of the Wood Elf models like the Eternal Guard Wild Riders, the Sisters of the Thorn, and even one of the High Elf units, the Sisters of the Watch, formerly known as Sisters of Avalon, are all part of the Wanderers sub-faction in Cities of Sigmar. We did lose a few of the Wood Elf models along the way in Warhammer Age of Sigmar. Warhawk Riders, War Dancers, Way Watchers are no longer part of the army. Unfortunately, these are all great things that are now lost in time, but they could always be used as particularly decent Cities of Sigmar models. Wood Elves, and well, rather Sylvaneth in general, look to be getting a release on the horizon, with Kurnothi popping up here and there, which are these bestial take on the old Wood Elves. Very sort of Orion themed Wood Elves, much more, I guess, savage than their normal compatriots. Wood Elves are an easy army to get in Warhammer Age of Sigmar with. If you've got plenty of tree spirits, you've got a cool little army there that's fantastic to paint, and a bunch of the new Sylvaneth models are absolutely amazing. Dwarfs, unlike Elves, only really, the old models only fit into Cities of Sigmar. You've got a ton of dwarf kits that have unfortunately been discontinued since the end of Warhammer Fantasy, and you're left with a very bare bones minimum. However, a lot of the models can be used as stands-in of their Free Guild and Elven brethren inside the Cities of Sigmar faction. Now, what's interesting about dwarfs though is if you are a dwarf fan, there's a ton of different options and pathways you can go in Warhammer Age of Sigmar on how to expand. If maybe Cities of Sigmar is not the way you're planning on going, you can take a look at two of the brand new dwarven factions that come out in Warhammer Age of Sigmar. As mentioned, we've seen two brand new types of dwarf appear in Warhammer Age of Sigmar. First being the Fyreslayers, which does take a bunch of the Slayer aesthetic from Warhammer Fantasy, though they are entirely new models, different range completely, and your old models really don't fit the bill of any of them. though they could maybe be used as Volkite Berserkers. You need some serious rebasing though. The Fyreslayers are the Slayer aesthetic taken to a whole new level, given the fire sort of feel, and they are this amazing look bunch of models. On the other hand, we have the Kharadron Overlords, who are an entirely new range of models, which are skyfaring airship driving dwarves that power their airships with totally not magic gold. For this, if you're a Dwarf fan, this is probably the best way to get into Warhammer Age of Sigmar. After you've started playing a few games with your Cities of Sigmar, I'd recommend probably going to this. What's cool is Kharadron Overlords also can be found in Cities of Sigmar in the Tempest Eye sub-allegiance, where you can mix your Dispossessed and your Kharadron Overlords together. Also, there is a Kharadron Overlords sub-faction called Barak Thring, which allows you to take Kharadron Overlords, Fyreslayers, and Dispossessed all in the same army, and even adding Gotrek Gurnisson himself if you feel like it. Yes, Gotrek Gurnisson survived to Warhammer Age of Sigmar. Now, I get to the part of the video that's going to make maybe some of you sad and a little bit disgruntled, and that is Tomb Kings and Bretonnia. You may have seen are missing from the rest of the video, and that is because unfortunately these two armies have been entirely discontinued in Warhammer Age of Sigmar. They no longer exist in any fashion. Probably the closest you've got to either of these is with Tomb Kings. We've had a, I guess, sort of semi-reimagining in the Ossiarch Bone Rippers, though it's nowhere near exact. It does not have any of the Egyptian aesthetic to it. Much more sort of Eastern inspired rather than anything, but they have things like skeletal constructs, catapults, potentially maybe archers in the future, and all that sort of stuff. For me, Tomb Kings and Bretonnia really don't have anything. You do, however, have the ability to play these models with Legacy War Scrolls in Warhammer Age of Sigmar if you choose to do so, but just realize these scrolls aren't updated in any way and generally now aren't accepted in any form of match play event. So that is worth considering when you're thinking about that. However, this being said, it's unfortunate these two armies have been discontinued, but you never know what the future holds for Warhammer Age of Sigmar. We're seeing plenty of things come back, and maybe these will come back as well someday. Who knows? Well, thank you all for watching the video. Please don't forget to leave a comment with your thoughts down below, and also leave a like and subscribe to the channel. All that helps everyone find the channel that little bit easier. If you'd like to come chat more with me and other members of our little community, you can do so by following the link in the description of the video to our Discord server. And also, while you're at it, go check out my featured channels on YouTube, which contain a bunch of other fantastic Warhammer Age of Sigmar focused channels that do everything from battle reports, painting videos, tactical videos, and more besides. Lastly though, we'd like to give a shout out to everyone who helps support the channel via YouTube members or Patreon. Thank you to James, AJC, JC, Christian Weir, Philip Ward, Soren, Kenny Lyle, Outer and Shot First, Cowspawn, James Crowder, Andrew Jarvis, and Andrew Bowen. Thank you all so much for supporting the channel, and if you'd like to help support the channel like they do, you can do so by following one of the links to either our YouTube members or Patreon in the description of the video below. Thank you all for watching. Once again though, stay safe everyone, stay well, and most of all, keep fighting that war against the grey. Ciao for now.